I'm feeling tired and sleepy. I need coffee. For me, working without coffee is impossible. I always say coffee is my drug, and my favorite coffee place is Starbucks. Speaking of coffee, I remember witnessing a weird incident that occurred last year at Starbucks. A woman was convicted of drug trafficking. She didn't look like someone capable of committing such a crime, but we should never judge a book by its cover. My name is Laurel Smith. I'm 23 years old, and I work as a journalist in Michigan. While working as a journalist, I was assigned to interview the football team. So I went to the football tournament stadium and gathered as much information as I could get. After that, I began to take interviews, and there was one player who was trying to flirt with me. During the interview, I tried to avoid his cheesy answers. Although his answers were funny, I didn't laugh. After finishing the interview, he came to me and asked me for coffee. He was good looking, so I accepted the offer. His name was Andrew. He was tall and handsome. We decided to meet the next day at Starbucks and also exchange numbers. I had an ulterior motive behind it. I wanted to get an inside scoop on the football game. The next morning, Andrew texted me and asked me about the meeting time. I told him we'll meet during my lunch hour at Starbucks near my office, so I went there at lunchtime, but Andrew wasn't there yet. I waited for him for a while, and when he didn't show up, I decided to go back. While I was leaving the cafe, I saw him standing with a woman. It made me furious for some reason, so I went toward him and said, "This was a sick idea of a prank." Andrew was startled to see me, and he looked like he didn't understand why I was behaving like that. Honestly, I didn't either. I went back to the office without eating lunch. After around 30 minutes, I was called to my team leader's cabin. My team leader said that a football star is asking around for me. I was shocked to hear that. My team leader assessed the situation perfectly and told me to use this opportunity to get close to the player. He told me to get an exclusive interview with Andrew. Andrew was the ace of the football team and a star player. He was like a celebrity. I went back to my cabin and called Andrew to apologize for my behavior. He told me he would only forgive me if I agreed to go on another coffee date. I told him to meet me on the weekend. On the weekend, we met at the same Starbucks. This time, he came before me and had ordered my favorite coffee, which was shocking and creepy, so I asked him, "How did you find out about my favorite coffee?" He pointed towards his phone. I was confused. He looked at me and said, "I stalked your Instagram account." Then he took a pause and laughed. I was still confused. After chatting for a little while, I felt the need to use the restroom. I told Andrew that I was going to the restroom, and I went there. After I returned, I saw a woman sitting in front of Andrew. It was the same woman from that day. Andrew still hadn't explained himself for that day, and now this again? This time, instead of walking away, I decided to confront them. I went ahead and asked Andrew, "What's this about?" He replied, "Before you misunderstand, I want you to calm down and listen first." Without saying anything, I sat there and started to listen. Andrew told me that the woman's name was Betty. She was homeless and a single mother. She needed funds to raise her child, so he decided to donate money to her. Judging by her appearance, it wasn't hard to believe that she was not very well off. After explaining the situation to me, the woman thanked Andrew for giving her a check. Andrew apologized to me and told me not to share this with anyone. I felt bad for doubting him. So I asked him to meet next week, but he told me that he won't be able to meet next week because of a semi-final match. He dropped me home after that. We became friends, and he shared some spicy stories about the football team. I was happy to get the scoop that I wanted, and I began to like Andrew. After his semi-final match, we met at Starbucks. His team had won and was going to the final tournament. I was happy for him. There were several articles about Andrew, and one of the argues was about him dating me. It was written by my colleague Sasha. everyone was teasing me at my workplace. I was happy on the inside, but acted as if it made me angry. A day before Andrew's final match, we met at the same Starbucks. Andrew told me that he liked me and asked me to watch the football game the next day. When I went to the stadium, I looked for Andrew everywhere, but he was nowhere to be found. The coach told me he was not picking up his phone, so he had sent someone to pick him up from his home. The match was about to begin. The rival team was already there, and the announcer was calling the names of the players. Everyone else was present except for Andrew. Sasha called me and told me to go to the police station. When I reached there, I found out that Andrew had been arrested for driving after taking drugs. This was a big shock for me. I asked him what happened. He said that someone spiked his coffee at Starbucks. I asked him to tell me the details. He told me that he went to Starbucks before going to the stadium, and there he met Betty and gave her another check for donation. Then he took his coffee and returned to his car. I figured out what was going on, so I told the police about Betty. After investigation, the police found out that Betty was indeed a drug trafficker. Andrew got released, and Betty got arrested for drug trafficking and spiking his coffee. Andrew did not get to play in the final match. His innocence was proven, so he was allowed to continue his athletic career. I got a big scoop and got promoted. After that day, I never talked to Andrew, nor did he try to contact me again. I knew what happened, but kept quiet. Andrew was never making donations. Betty was his drug dealer all along. Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. The first and the last time that I ever went to the Starbucks was with my friend Nate. He told me that the coffee there is great and that I can befriend some girls in there. Though the thing with Nate was that it was all about the girls for him, and I didn't care much about that, at least not until I actually left for college. My school were just over, and Nate was already starting the first year of college. He was a year older than me, and he was already settling into the college, and I was about to join him in the same college a year later. And Nate always told me, with girls, you want to be experienced as you can, because college is rough as an inexperienced person. And when I often asked him, isn't college for studies? And he would just say, yes, if you want to be a doctor or something, but even nerds need to have a good time in there. And even though every time he opened his mouth he sounded like an idiot, inside he was actually a very caring and generous man, and a great friend on top of that. To top it all off, he was an A student and have gotten into all Ivy League colleges but ignore them. He was a legend to us, and that is why I looked up to him. He was a great mentor regardless of that shallow image that he tried to show often. Our friendship was much more than I had with everyone who was in my class, so I hang out with Nate often. Nate was the kind of person you would think would be very communist on the edge, kind of the guy, but with all the things considered, he was very much into Starbucks, and it was the same Starbucks that he would go to every time. It was weird at first when I thought about it, and then I realized that it wasn't actually the coffee that he was interested in. As a matter of fact, it was the girl who made it. Nate was in love with this girl who worked at the Starbucks, and he often visited the place because of the girl. At first you wouldn't know that he was infatuated by her, but the frequent visits and the occasional blushing when she was around made it certain that Nate wasn't at the place for the sake of coffee. It was the first time that I saw Nate acting weird and underconfident. You wouldn't cross him as someone who would be this blushing and so quiet. It was out of ordinary for him to act in such a way. But it was Nate. He was obsessive in everything he did. And this felt like one of those occasions. Every single time we went to the Starbucks, he would line up and switch lines when she wasn't the one serving the coffee. Then one day when we were sitting, I said to Nate, "Come on, man, you have to ask her out. You're freaking Nate. You're the boss, man." And Nate looked at me as he wanted to get back the confidence that he was losing, and decided that he will ask the girl out. And he did. Her name was Natalie. and they were Nate and Natalie and looked so good together. But they were meant to be together. They were pretty much in love, and now that Nate had Natalie, he would spend much less time. Nate even thanked me when they got together, as if I did everything. Nate and Natalie were going perfectly, and now we would hang out more in the Starbucks and get more and more free coffees. They were all good and tight, when one day, something happened that forever changed everything. It was the usual Friday night, and we were all at the Starbucks. Nate was sitting around, and Natalie was waiting for the shift to get over, and then from the front gate, the guy came in. His name was Michael. Michael was one of those quiet kids that always had a thing for Natalie. He came inside, and straight away came over to our table and said to Nate, "You're not good enough for Natalie. You'll never be. And you try, I will make sure you die." And then Nate said, "All right, man," and then shrugged him off. But that must have pissed off Michael, because the next thing he did was took the gun out and then shot Nate in his chest. There was nothing but silence. Nate's blood spattered across my face, and I was in shock of everything. And Nate was lying lifeless, and I was in complete trauma of losing my friend. And then that was the day that I last entered the Starbucks. There are still flashbacks of the incident that keep me awake in the night.
For the past few years or so, I've lived here in Redwood City, California. Back in 2008, some of you might remember that a Philadelphia branch of Starbucks asked two African Americans to leave because they hadn't bought anything. They were accused of racism, there was a whole bunch of fallout from it, and in the end, Starbucks announced that it would no longer ask anyone to leave their stores as long as they weren't causing a disturbance. From what I heard, this prompted a bunch of trouble with homeless people hanging around Starbucks outlets and generally making a nuisance of themselves, but I can't really speak to that because the only homeless guy that ever showed up in my local Starbucks was Steve. Steve was about as far from the stereotypical idea of a homeless person as you can imagine. I remember seeing him in relatively clean clothes, tapping away on a smartphone that was charging from a nearby power outlet and not giving him a second glance. I walked in, got my coffee, and carried on my way to work. The next morning, Steve is there again, paper in front of him, tapping away on his smartphone. Only this time, as I'm in line waiting to give my order, I see him reaching for a grubby-looking backpack that seemed to contain all of his worldly possessions. It dawned on me that he didn't have a coffee in front of him, and when I thought about it, he didn't have one that day before either. And that's when I realized that Steve was in fact homeless. And it was then that I actually noticed how tired he looked, how the skin of his face was stretched around his eye sockets like he'd skipped one too many meals in his time. Steve was obviously taking advantage of Starbucks' new policy in order to get indoors and charge his phone, and although he was technically taking up the space of a paying customer, none who got an inkling of his living situation ever seemed to complain. This was until one day when Steve got himself into some kind of confrontation with a customer. I think maybe one of his bag straps was lying in the way of someone because I only looked up in time after hearing someone apologize. This big guy in a bad suit scoffed as he sat down close by, shaking his head. "Shouldn't even be here," the big guy said. I thought it was quite an obnoxious comment, but I'm far too much of an introvert to say anything about it. Steve tried to apologize again, but the guy started going off on him, telling him he shouldn't be there if he wasn't a paying customer. And in a display of kindness that'll stay with me for the rest of my life, the guy at the head of the line bought Steve a coffee and a red berry cheese Danish. There, now he has something, so mind your business. It wasn't one of those, and then everyone clapped, moments. It was still incredibly awkward since no one wanted to get into a shouting match at that time in the morning, especially not me. So after the fat guy was shamed into silence, he just sort of wrapped his double-smoked bacon and walked out, avoiding eye contact as he went. That's when I found out his name was Steve, and every morning after, if Steve was in the Starbucks, I'd always say hi and asked if he wanted a coffee or a red berry cheese. Some mornings he'd accept, some he'd decline, and I came to learn that he used the charger and the free Wi-Fi to look for a job. He wasn't a drug addict, he wasn't an alcoholic, He'd just fallen on hard times after a nervous breakdown and was slowly building himself back up and putting his life back together. Learning that is how me and a handful of other Starbucks regulars developed a great deal of affection for Steve after a while, but our regular cheery encounters with him somehow made it easier to forget that he slept under Redwood Junction every night, and I guess assuring ourselves that Steve would be okay meant we could just walk away and not worry about it. Because one Monday morning when I walked into the Starbucks and saw Steve's seat empty, I automatically assumed it was good news. Maybe he'd found a place to stay, or maybe he'd struck gold in his job search, and I found myself asking the barista if they'd heard anything from Steve over the weekend. To my absolute delight, he told me Steve had an interview at a local car wash. He wasn't sure exactly what day, he just knew that Steve had made the announcement the previous afternoon before departing the store. So, that was the end of seeing Steve on my morning Starbucks runs. I hoped that he might show up again, buying his own coffee, looking healthier and happier, but he didn't, and I guess that was just fine. But at the same time, I'd have been lying if I said I didn't kind of miss him. Like I might have mentioned, I'm a card-carrying introvert, but I do enjoy a sense of community. I still enjoy the comfort of familiar faces, so anyone who makes me comfortable enough to come out of my shell, I appreciate that more than I think I can even describe. So after a few weeks of not seeing Steve at all, I decided to take a walk down to some of the local car washes to see if I could spot Steve. First place I asked hadn't heard of him, neither had the second place. But the third car wash I tried said that they were hoping I was the one who could give them answers. You see, the third place I tried was indeed the same place Steve had an interview scheduled, but it was an interview he hadn't shown up for. I asked if he'd called ahead to cancel or anything, and the car wash boss said no, and that he just ghosted. And that's when I really started to worry. My concern for Steve's well-being grew to the point where I began to entertain the idea of going down to the Redwood Junction to look for him. I hope I don't sound too prejudiced when I say I found it an intimidating prospect. Like, as much as I appreciate that a lot of homeless people are just like Steve, good people who've fallen on hard times, I know that there are some people in the streets who are so broken that they do actually pose a danger to the general public. But as I said, my concern grew and grew until I didn't give good care if the sight of homeless people camp would upset my delicate sensibilities. A man's life was at stake. I needed to act. I wasn't sure I'd be able to live with myself otherwise. That was how I ended up cycling down to the junction one Saturday afternoon, where I began nervously giving descriptions of Steve and asking if people had seen him. People mostly shook their heads at me, looking at me like I'd grown an extra nose or something. I guess having visitors to the camp wasn't exactly a common occurrence. Time and time again, I was met with the same response. A shrug, a shake of the head, complete indifference. At least until I spoke to one much older guy who wore a Vietnam veteran baseball cap and a grimy old fatigue jacket. This guy seemed a little bit more with it than some of the other homeless folks, and although he had the distinct smell of marijuana about him, he was lucid enough to get a straight answer from. After confirming we were talking about the same Steve, this vet told me that he knew him well, but that he hadn't been around the junction in a few days. When I pressed him for where Steve might have gone, the vet shrugged, but told me Steve had left behind a bunch of his belongings. According to him, this could be a good thing just as much as a bad thing. When some homeless folks find a way off the street, either moving back in with family or getting a place in a program somewhere, they leave behind all their stuff. Some just don't need it anymore. A tent and a sleeping bag are useless when you have a room and a bed. But others find that the stuff they had on the street just reminds them of a time they'd rather just forget about. But sometimes, leaving all their stuff behind meant something bad had happened. I could see the worry just etched into the vet's face, and he seemed to be racking his brain for a moment before an idea struck him. He mentioned that Steve used to bring food to a girl who stayed on the other side of the camp, and that maybe she'd know where he was. Up until talking to that girl, my time at the camp had been unexpectedly uplifting. Sure, seeing people living like that was upsetting, but seeing how nice some of them were, how they hadn't let their hardships break them down, seeing them purely as the human beings they are. I have to say, it was quite cathartic. Yet the visit to the girl's tent was the point at which the trip became more terrifying than I ever imagined it could be. As we approached the girl's tent, the vet greeted someone nearby and asked if a person called Mouse was home. They nodded, but added that she wasn't doing too good. I wasn't sure what they meant by that, but on seeing this Mouse girl curled up in a fetal position in her tent, I was almost certain it was drug-related. The vet gently shook the girl awake, and I'm pretty sure she was high from the way she lazily opened her eyes and how out of it she seemed. But then as soon as the guy mentioned Steve's name, the girl shoots wide open, and she gives him this terrified look before saying, I told him not to go. I told him not to, but he didn't listen. Now he's gone." The vet asks her where. Where did she tell Steve not to go? She replies with, "The cemetery," before bursting into tears. The last question we could get her to answer was what happened at the cemetery for Steve to be gone. She replied with, "It took him." It. Not he or they. It. Hearing that word used like that caused this sinking feeling in my stomach. Not so much because of what it entailed, but because this girl was so messed up over what happened, and that obviously meant bad news for Steve. Before leaving the camp, I asked the vet what cemetery Mouse could have been talking about. I had my own idea of which one she was referring to. I just wanted to see if he had the same answer, and he did. He'd said he'd bet his last dime that she was talking about the historic Union Cemetery on Woodside Road. And I agreed because the historic Union Cemetery is right across the street from the hand car wash where Steve was scheduled to have his interview. I took all this information to the police, telling them I was a friend of Steve's before I had them file a missing persons report. I made sure to record the reference number I was giving, as I'd be able to use it to get in touch with whatever detectives would eventually be assigned to the case, I assumed. I tried all throughout that next week to get the relevant cops on the phone, but it seemed to take forever before the case was properly assigned. In the meantime, I thought I'd take a ride down to the cemetery to see if anything caught my eye. I don't really know what I was planning on doing. It's not like I knew anything about being a detective, but at the same time, I couldn't just sit on my butt and do nothing. So, for those of you that don't know, Redwood City's historic Union Cemetery isn't really a cemetery. It did actually function as one until about 1919 or so, but after that it basically became a kind of memorial. From what I can remember, some Civil War soldiers are buried there along with a few famous pioneers, so it's more for tourists and sightseers than grieving families or funeral processions. While walking up and down the gravel paths and checking out the old graves, it occurred to me that when the girl said, Steve is in the cemetery, it might have been her way of telling us that he was dead. There was every chance we just totally misinterpreted that, and I was in that cemetery on a complete fool's errand, wasting my time looking for something I wouldn't find. And if that's the case, what I found and saw next is completely irrelevant, and is naturally to be disregarded. But, and a big but here, if it is connected to the Steve disappearance, it raises questions that honestly don't bear thinking about. So, as I said, I'm walking down this gravel path, and a handful of people I see are just all checking out the statues, taking pictures, and all that other stuff. Only, I see this one guy, all by his lonesome, and he's walking with purpose, with a plastic bag in his hand. When I say walking with purpose, I mean he wasn't there just to hang around and check out the memorials. He was walking fast, like he wanted in and out in as short a time as possible. Just the sight of him filled me with curiosity, but it's not like if I rushed after him, he wouldn't freak out. So as much as I tried my best to follow him, he slipped away from my view almost as quickly as he had appeared. Only he'd left something behind, the white plastic bag having just dumped it behind one of the bleach-white tombstones, apparently in the hopes that it would remain hidden from public view. At first, I was just mad, like who leaves their trash in a graveyard or whatever. But I went to check out what the bag contained. It just looked like a bunch of organ meat. Like I 100% saw something dark enough to be liver in there, and some of the other pieces looked like chunks of white fat. It smelled real bad too, like he might have been hanging on to it for a couple of days before he'd left it there. To this day, it's probably one of the weirdest things to ever happen to me. Finding a bag of meat like that, just abandoned in the middle of a ceremonial cemetery. And like I said, whether or not it's even remotely connected to Steve's disappearance is anyone's guess. I mean, the detectives treated me like I was crazy when I brought it up with them in the weeks that followed. They'd sent some beat cops out to the cemetery and they hadn't found a thing. But I also know they seemed totally clueless in their investigation, like they either didn't care about it or just couldn't get a lead anywhere. And that's just how things went. I get in touch every so often, only to be told the investigator hadn't progressed anywhere. It didn't help that it had taken weeks for anyone to report him missing, and the fact that it was me that should have acted earlier gave me this horrendous sense of guilt for the longest time. Steve had no family out here, and I barely knew anything about him. The best I could do was share the few slivers of info I had with the cops, then just hope it came to something. But it came to nothing, and now Steve is just one more name on the missing persons register, a missing persons register that stretches a mile long. The rate at which homeless people go missing around Redwood City is considerably higher than the surrounding areas, and given how difficult it is to conduct any kind of census or research among the homeless, that figure could be even higher than the numbers suggest. The trouble is, people just don't care. Even people who purport to care about social justice are content to focus their attentions on ridiculous niche topics when homeless people are dying and disappearing on the streets of California every single day. I don't know what's going on out here. Whether or not it's just fentanyl killing people off, some kind of serial killer, or something less explainable. But something is killing homeless people at a totally disproportionate rate, and all kinds of other weird stuff is going on to boot. I just pray that whatever it is can be identified and stopped before more people like Steve are lost. People who try so hard to tread water, only to end up slipping beneath the waves.